Welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining us for a very special session of the Evaluation Observatory, which is a platform for learning and knowledge exchange in the social impact and evaluation ecosystem. I'm Sabeena Mathayas. I'm VP at Sambodhi Research and Communications, and it's my distinct honor to bring together a very accomplished panel with deep practitioner insights. We have Ved, Aparajita, and Maaike, who will all bring some very interesting perspectives to a topic that I'm very passionate about, and I'm glad that they're here to speak about, which is about economies for impact, or the social impact economy. I'm going to set a little bit of context before I introduce and we get right into it. Earlier this year, the Securities and Exchange Board of India had proposed a social stock exchange to boost the social and environmental impact investing in India and to fund the social sector organizations and enable direct listing through a new class of securities, as well as establishing a standardized framework for measuring and reporting social impact for both donors and investors. Now, the social stock exchange would essentially be a market maker, channeling public and private impact investment towards the SDGs, while also playing an important role in supporting solutions to problems that have conventionally been considered part of the public sector, or solely the role of the domain of the public sector. Social enterprises, that is entities with a very specific government or environmental or social objective, have gained ground since the 2000s in India, attracting over 5.2 billion in US dollars in investments. Now, they could be legally for-profit or not-for-profit enterprises, and the key difference being that the former can raise equity while the latter can't. And not in all situations. And this is the kind of perspective actually that we're going to address here. Now, as India explores the SSE, what we are going to be talking about is how capital to create sizable and measurable impact can be created through the SSE across multiple kinds of solutions. But this also calls for a minimum standard or a standardized framework for measuring and reporting social impact. The problem has always been about how do we understand what is really social and what do we count as social impact. So the current frameworks to manage and measure social impact suffer from several challenges, such as the prioritization of profits, the inability to objectively monetize or standardize the different conceptions or levels of social impact, and the lack of engagement and accountability to the end user. Like, ultimately, it is how do we engage stakeholders meaningfully, and what does it mean to actually bring them into the conversation and report and engage them in what it means to be a social enterprise. So this webinar is hopefully going to explore the business case for evaluating things, as it draws from the best practice and process of the evaluation community, and also from the social enterprise community and investors as well. Learning from the panel of impact agents, whom I'm very happy to be introducing in a few minutes. This is going to hopefully work towards a holistic framework, or at least a holistic set of desirables that we would like to, that captures relevant and meaningful metrics for impact, so that all stakeholders involved are able to understand the pros and cons of different approaches, and they develop measurement practices for their social enterprises. I'm actually going to kick us right off with our first speaker for the day, who is Mr. Ved Arya. He's a developmental entrepreneur and an author. He founded SRIJAN, a not-for-profit working to empower rural communities through sustainable livelihood management, and the Buddha Fellowship Program, which is a platform for young emerging leaders to become development entrepreneurs. He's the founding convener of the RCRC Coalition and a member of several policymaking bodies, including the Advisory Committee, Promotion of Producers Enterprises, and the Ministry of Rural Development. Ved is actually an aeronautical engineer from IIT Kanpur and a management graduate from IIM Ahmedabad. He's a Hubert Humphrey Fellow from 1990-1991, and pursued also his further education from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and also has worked with the World Bank. Ved, over to you.
Thank you, Sabeena. You should say Ved was an aeronautical engineer, or Ved was a management graduate, Ved was a Humphrey Fellow. So I don't think these things matter anymore. And those degrees have to be torn and thrown aside in the Arabic Sea if they are of any use. Because I think the moment we enter the world of practitioners, I don't know how much use those degrees are. But of course, we can't throw them aside because oftentimes they give us the gate pass to go and meet the policymakers, or or forums like this. Otherwise, it's so difficult. There's so much elitism in the world. But I think, thank you so much for inviting me here, and I'm honored to meet you, to meet Aparajita and Maaike. I'm in that August company, and I am very, very happy to be speaking to a very large number of listeners today. Although I like to keep it short, but one thing I'm now doing nowadays is to to wallow in the sea of hopes and fears normally. So I am giving into speaking or reading about a poem somewhere or the other. I pick up something which, because I think life is all about dreams, as you are saying today. Whether it was SSE or today's thing, we have some dream, we have some hope that we will solve this problem of evaluation, and we are going to be in good business. At least some of you would be in business after the session, I hope. So that those are those hopes. So I think I want to start with one little 2-line stanza from a poem that Gulzar wrote for a movie called Rockford. I don't know, Shankar Mahadevan sings it. I don't know whether you've seen the movie. And it says, आसमां के पार शायद, आसमां के पार शायद और कोई आसमां होगा, बादलों के पर्वतों पर कोई बारिश का मकान होगा, मैं हवा के परों पर कहाँ जा रहा हूँ कहाँ. It goes on like this. So you're building castles in the air. Maaike, I'm trying to convey this meaning that we all dream. We want to build a house of rain over clouds. So we actually all dream impossible dreams. SSE is one of those impossible dreams. And many of my work, SRIJAN or whatever I've tried to do, we start with those hopes and those dreams. That's why I thought it's important to bring the dimension of being, all of us are romantics, or all of us are children at heart, because we want to do something new and we want to realize what we want to start with this. So I want to talk about the social stock exchange being a dream. Dream doesn't mean it's a real dream, and we hope it is not an unreal dream. What is the social stock exchange hope and dream? It is that we will remove the trust deficit between the market players and the people who are NGOs, those who are in the not-profit sector primarily, not so much on the for-profit enterprises, but the not-for-profit organizations, NPO they call it. There is supposed to be a trust deficit. There's supposed to be a dichotomy between the people who make profit and therefore they can donate, and the people who actually don't make profit and they've given their life to doing something for society. So there is a fundament, that's an assumption, and therefore social stock exchange thought that if we could find ways of listing them in a stock exchange, and they call it social stock exchange, then probably Janta, public will see that these people have met certain criteria of minimum eligibility. What is that criteria? Criteria has as you talk about SDGs, there are some list of eligible activities. If they do that, whether it's for social purposes, for environmental purposes, for girls' education, or for healthcare of the tribals, whatever those list of activities we have drawn up from wherever, they are the ones who probably will be able to apply. But that is not enough. People can say, I'm doing this and I'm doing that for the poor people. So our listing criteria has some norms which says that you should be able to meet certain governance and accountability norms. Now, what does it mean? Often people will accuse not only in the private not-for-profit sector, there are bhai bhatijawat, meaning there are blood relatives, there are people who are husband and wife or cousins or whatever, they are ruling the they are the, so how do you meet the governance norms which is above certain questions, and there's accountability. That means you present your balance sheet or whatever accounts of your expenditure to general public. You should be able to upload your balance sheets, your financial statements for everyone to see. If somebody wants to give money from say Kolaba in Bombay or MG Road in Bangalore, they should be sufficiently convinced looking at your balance sheet, your accounts there. So, I'm just trying to say that the government or SEBI is trying to build a system by which people can see make the things visible for the donor person who has money. So this is the whole effort in the social stock exchange. I'll not dwell further on this. Let me say what are the other key issues with social enterprises. I am talking about the young social enterprises, also the established social enterprises. So examples of Buddha Fellow, I will take young person like Kaushal, who is a IIT Kanpur graduate of 2002. He worked in Infosys and several IT companies, set up his own IT enterprise, and then decided one day to give it all up and say that I want to join Professor Tilochan Shastri and join Farm with a brand of selling things that are made of peanut or groundnut or ragi or something which is produced by farmers and sell it in Bangalore. Now, what happens? He is more interested in the beginning of his journey to create impact. Now, ask him to say measure your impact is difficult. So, what we are trying, so he is saying, okay, the turnover of this company before I joined was 10 lakhs, I made it 55 lakhs. So his measure of performance is first revenue itself. Then he will look at profitability. Then he'll look at how many farmers he's buying the peanut for, groundnut for, etc. So the reason I mentioned this is, let me give you another example. In SRIJAN's watershed program, we are more interested in actually how many cubic meters of water we have collected in a pond or or any other water harvesting structure. So I think oftentimes we limit ourselves to just measuring the output, but to measure impact, how many farmers are actually benefiting, are they benefiting more than other places, that with same amount of money, what it could get. There are those questions that often implementers, people who are in action, they see that we don't have time, or not that we cannot be bothered about, but I think this is the first challenge that we face, that their primary energy or maximum amount of energy goes in creating impact with the target community. That is the first thing I want to say, whether it's for profit or not for profit organizations with intent to create social impact. So that is the first thing I want to say. What happens in measurement? Measurement is the creation of some metrics by which you will say this person is doing well or not doing well. What those metrics are, in our sector, we try to say that can we do participatory evaluation? That means can we jointly evaluate the output of the effort that is being made. One other part of the evaluation or metrics is, or building the metrics is that, okay, you and I, evaluator and implementer, can come to an agreement, but what about community? So in SSE also, we struggled with this. We can have social auditors, but unless you go and actually visit the field and see whether, and take the community's point of view. I'm not calling the mines that are disrupting the lives in Niyamgiri. That is not the example I'm taking, but even simple thing that we do, say lift irrigation or any watershed program, then how, unless you talk to community, unless you say find out from them whether they found their land to be double cropped, I think the evaluation or impact evaluation or impact measurement is not complete. Now, why that is the problem is that sometimes we find that we will create a new band of impact measurers or evaluators who have no clue of what is socio-economic condition of the community is, how hard it is to create an impact, and therefore measurement can be harsh. How do you make the social auditors or evaluators sensitive to local community as well as to implementers who, I'm not having but this is a normal problem. I'm not saying nobody is holier than thou, but this is the problem that we come across. The last thing I want to say is that even though measurement is a problem, even though evaluators' attitude or implementers' attitude of not accepting each other may be an issue, then the development impact bonds, which we have got included in this SSC's report, there is a solution. That means that the investors and the risk takers and the implementers, they come together on a common measurement of the impact they would like to create. In education, for example, if learning outcome and measuring the methodology of measuring the learning outcome is agreed between the agencies who will apply for the development impact bond and those who will invest in this kind of impact bond, then I think we have found a solution. So I want to end my talk, my piece, by saying solutions are possible. People have to come for a partnership that we both of us are interested in creating impact, whether it's education or it's water or it's health. Then I think money can also come and people can be can offer to come forward and say, you can measure my impact, but these are the criteria we all agreed to and these are the methodology we have agreed to. With this note, I want to thank Sabeena for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ved. And I will come back to you about a couple of different things that you talked about, you touched on, which is some of the sensitivity that's required and the tensions between community reporting versus operational needs. And then obviously how we communicate and talk about impact, which is something enterprises may not always have the bandwidth or the resources to do. But so I'll hold that thought, pin it down for you. So for later, we'll definitely talk about it. I'd now like to invite Aparajita. Aparajita leads a value for women's overall strategy and partnerships development efforts, and which devises new ways for organizations to adopt gender inclusive practices. Aparajita brings over 19 years of experience in impact investing, social entrepreneurship, strategic partnerships, and business development, especially in developing markets like India, Indonesia, and Kenya. Previously, Aparajita was a co-founder at Intellicap, where she led Sankalp Forum as a global impact investing convening. She also served as the India director for the British Asian Trust, and she's based in Goa. And Aparajita, over to you.
Thanks, Sabeena, and thank you, Ved. That was, I think, a great start to this discussion. I definitely wanted to thank the organizers here before I get started on my points, but I also think that this is an extremely timely discussion, especially as, you know, as development and investment professionals or practitioners, we have been seeing the emergence of countless frameworks, methodologies for both impact measurement, evaluation, monitoring frameworks, and we see that as development practitioners, we see that the kind of confusion it causes for new organizations coming up in the space, be it very socially minded, social impact focused organizations, or organizations that are operating at the cusp of profit and purpose, where they really struggle to figure out what they should be doing in terms of measuring and tracking their own impact. And that's something which is a very real challenge that most development organizations go through. What we see as a result is a bit of a reactive methodology that often comes into place, because each time they are measuring their impact, it is for a donor or for an investor, and usually it is, you know, it is as unique as it can be for each organization, for lack of a better way of putting this. And I think that's, while it's problematic at some extent, it's also, I think, symptomatic of an evolving development sector. I mean, at the end of the day, we've only had a few decades of this sector operating independently, and I think in each country, you know, we see in each region, we see development sectors like ours have to go through a fairly sort of long period of growth and evolution that works for them. And I think that's sort of important to remember in the context of India, which is extremely diverse. Coming to looking at, just talking about the need for standardizing impact metrics or even frameworks. And I'm sorry, I'll be using these terms interchangeably because I don't come from an evaluation background, but I think, but we definitely deal with organizations that look at it from an impact measurement perspective, others that are looking at more as an M&E framework, yet others who are looking at it from a pure reporting framework. So I'm going to use these sort of slightly interchangeably. But when we talk about standardizing evaluation frameworks or impact metrics, to put it really simply, I mean, we do need some level of standardization, and it may not be something that works for the entire sector, but companies, organizations, they need to speak the same language as their investors. And I'm again using the term investors fairly loosely. It could be donors, it could be it could be people who have poured their sort of investment in actual capital or in sweat and equity in any form. In case of social impact investors, at least in most of the development world, we see we've seen evolution of several frameworks like IRIS, GEARS, which are being propagated by the Global Impact Investing Network, that I've already now established sort of common practice of using these across the organizations. For a community-based organization, this could be something like a guide star, as simple as that. For a global organization, we see more and more alignment towards sustainable development goals or the SDG language, because that's something that's broadly understood around regions and across countries. But again, it goes back to the same challenge that if an organization is asked to report to multiple funders, what is it that they should be reporting on? And the other challenge is that oftentimes when we're talking about social impact metrics, they are oriented towards outputs and activities. So what you see people measuring or what you see organizations measuring are what have they done. It's very hard for them to go that next step to be able to report on results and outcomes of the intervention. I may have created X number of jobs, but how have those jobs actually empowered people, or what have they changed in terms of, the next sort of level of impact that they would have achieved is often not as unidimensional. It's usually not a single organization or not a single program that contributes towards it. So the challenge around measuring activities and results, activities and outputs rather than results and outcomes is a very real challenge for most organizations that are working in the development space. In the context of the work that I do now at Value for Women, we run a specialized advisory firm. We help organizations advance gender inclusion, and we work with a range of partners and institutions that drive gender forward solutions within their business operations. Our work engages both investors as well as enterprises, funders, donors, foundations, intermediary organizations, as well as policy advocacy organizations and networks. And as we help them think through gender lens investing, in the case of investors, or gender forward business practices in the case of other non-investors, the question of measuring impact and having a solid monitoring and evaluation framework comes up almost in every assignment that we end up doing. It could be as simple as doing a project around helping people think through creating the gender action plan, but what do they measure and how do they measure it is something that keeps on coming up. But again, because the space is so new or reasonably new, we also see that there isn't, this is not standardized. There is a lot of, and we often end up suggesting ourselves sort of curating a solution that works for each partner. So each M&E framework looks different from the other. Each metric collection mechanism looks different. There are certain bases. There is a 2X framework guidelines that investors adhere to. There is the women empowerment principles or WEPs that largely anybody working in the women's economic empowerment space looks at. That said, those almost become the underlying factors or sort of almost like a checklist to adhere to. But then beyond that, the measurement often includes a range of methodologies and metrics that are very unique to each organization. For social stock exchange in India, I think it's it's really important to sort of, one, revisit the purpose and objective of starting it. It is not formed for improving impact in the country. And I think that's something that we have to keep front and center, right? Social stock exchange is not tasked with improving how much impact the organization, the sector can make, in the same way as the commercial stock exchanges cannot improve the GDP of a country, or cannot improve the employment levels of employment in the country. So I think that's one very key piece to remember. So the onus of impact measurement is not really on the social stock exchange or the powers that be in social stock exchange eventually, but is really so going back, why is the social stock exchange getting formed? It's to improve the access and availability of capital and the accountability that comes with it for social sector organizations. It is to help each of them be able to get equal, better capital equity, or better opportunities in being able to access capital that would otherwise be more dominated by certain relationships or certain blocks of capital providers. And I think once we understand that, it also becomes then important to see what are we talking about when it comes to standardizing or creating a common minimum standard or framework for evaluation. The way I see it, it could be a tiered approach. It could be something which is almost like, think about it like a Subway sandwich of having several options where you can decide what level of impact do you want to achieve as an organization that's potentially listed eventually on a social stock exchange, and that opens up different layers of capital to you. So the way I think about it is an option is a menu of options that people, or a menu of impact options that organizations can think about creating, because the deeper they go, the more, let's say, the more access to capital, or the more access to certain kinds of capital they might have. So if as an organization, I think I only want to work with a certain sector, it enables me to actually report my impact and outcomes in that particular sector, and enables me access to people who are looking at providing capital for that. So and this might be to Sabeena's horror, this might be not what you're expecting me to say, Sabeena, but I feel we are still at a very early stage on the social stock exchange, especially to think about creating a standardized or common minimum standard. But I think there is definite need for especially the networks and the self-regulatory organizations that are already working in different spaces, be it a Southern, or be it the NGO networks that are working in this space, or Global Impact Investing Network, or the India's Impact Investing Council. For all of them to come together and think about what are the different kind of ways in which organizations report their impact, and what are how do you create almost like a taxonomy of sort that allows people to be able to pick and choose and be able to literally check the boxes and say, this is where I am at. And it also gives them a pathway then to improve and deepen their impact as they go along in this journey, and enables them hence to access potentially increasing level of capital, and which comes with a different set of risk profile attached to it. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions, or hand it over back to you, Sabeena.
Aparajita, thank you so much. And again, there is a question very specifically for you, and I think we'll kind of take that on in the Q&A round, majorly because I do want to come back to this point that you brought up, where it might actually have to have like an impact pathway decided, that where you are at as an enterprise. I think that's a very interesting space to think, how far have you progressed, and can we then support you with capital or with other kinds of resources? And that's another thing that I'd love to hear from the investor community. Actually, is it just about capital at the end of the day, or are there other kinds of resources that also help support enterprises as they grow towards A, greater impact, and B, greater operational effectivity? I am actually going to bring in our last speaker for the day, Maaike. Maaike Bijker is the Monitoring and Evaluation Specialist at UNICEF India. She has over 10 years of experience in research and evaluation internationally. She leads the evidence team at UNICEF, which is responsible for the design and management of UNICEF-supported evaluations and also provides specialized technical support, research studies, and monitoring activities commissioned by UNICEF. In addition, Maaike leads UNICEF's external capacity building efforts in M&E, supporting partnerships for evidence across all UNICEF programmatic domains. Before joining UNICEF, Maaike worked as Senior Research Manager at JPAL South Asia in Delhi, leading a number of randomized control trials in the areas of immunization, adolescent empowerment, education, and environmental sustainability. She also worked with Dalberg in London, Sneha in Mumbai, and the University of Cambridge, UK on research and evaluation. So I'm going to give it to you, Maaike. Go for it.
Thank you, Sabeena. I have the wonderful task to be the third speaker after Ved and Aparajita, and I think they said a lot of the same things, actually, that I was going to talk about. First of all, Ved has made me feel like a poet, and Aparajita has made me hungry after speaking about Subway. So thanks to both of you for those metaphors. But I think what I just wanted to do essentially is speak a little bit from a monitoring and evaluation perspective. I have not been in social enterprises or part of social enterprises or worked necessarily directly with investors on this idea of how can you incorporate potentially social impact into your goals of either for-profit or non-for-profit. But of course, I am part of the development space. So what I thought I would quickly talk about is three main questions. What is social impact? I think that's exactly what Ved was already speaking to in Aparajita as well. How do we measure it well? And then why do we need evaluations? And how do we do good evaluations for social impact? Social impact evaluations, essentially. Now, before I go into that, I've been getting my head around, so things like the social stock exchange, I know development impact bonds, and I've sort of loosely been, reading up about them as well. As I was reading into this space, I also thought I would mention, and Aparajita mentioned it too, in terms of what her organization does, is social impact can also be achieved not just through having a specific social impact goal. That is sort of, the social enterprise, the CSR, angle. A lot of what actually UNICEF does around the world is making sure that in their normal value chains that outcomes for children, for example, are addressed in normal processes, policies, and standards that businesses do. So I just wanted to make a distinction that just because it's not a specific goal, I think doesn't mean that we can't contribute to it as a whole sector, right? In the profit sector, the for-profit sector especially. And I think that that's just worth considering because we can get at social impact in different ways. To sort of move on to then what is social impact, I think that's whether it's businesses or development actors or government, when we think from what we're trying to do, the first thing is really trying to establish what is really the end goal of the investment that we make and how will it be achieved. And I think like Aparajita and Ved said, this has to go beyond the inputs and the outputs, right? So it's beyond how many children have received school books, which might be a metric that, I guess a lot of CSR, investment or even social enterprises might report back on. This is how many children receive school books. Easy to measure. It's very easy to report and also very easy to sell. But what does it actually mean, right? So I think it's pushing that envelope a little bit further, exactly like Ved and Aparajita said, beyond just the outputs and the immediate outcomes. What does that actually mean for a child to receive books? Do their learning levels increase as a result of learning levels? Do they actually stay in school? Are they skilled? Do they get a job, etc.? So we have to think of it as a continuum. We then also face a particular challenge, I think, when we talk about social impact, because it's real social impact is actually very complex and it takes time. And one of the examples that I want to mention, and it's really from the development sector side, but I wanted to mention it because it's a really important topic for us, and it's really difficult to understand how we can move the needle on this, is ending child marriage. So ending child marriage in India is extremely complex. We know it requires multiple strategies, including girls go to school, that they're essentially empowered to make life decisions. But it also means changing general social and gender norms of the community, of the household. These are all barriers that at the moment mean that, unfortunately, a lot of girls are getting married. And to add to that complexity, so it's not just one strategy, it's multiple strategies. And to add to that complexity, what works in one area or for one community doesn't necessarily work for a different area or a different community. And that's where really, when you start looking at it from a relevance, so what works for whom, and an equity perspective, right? Who are those that are really being left out because you are not doing the right thing? So if that's the complex sort of situation and issue that you're thinking about, because that is social impact, that's how we improve the lives, for example, of adolescent girls in India. How do you measure that, right? We can't just have a story from the field, this worked. We need to be able to measure it across the results chain, down the chain, as well as really well. We need really good measurements. And this links to the second piece that I was going to say, the point that I said, it takes time. So social impact does not happen in 3 years, in 5 years, even 10 years, it happens in decades, right? And again, I think Ved and Aparajita mentioned that. So, you know, we know from looking at the life cycle approach that what happens to a child in their early development influences actually, for example, how they learn when they are teenagers, right? So a lot happens in the developmental years that ultimately affects what their outcomes will be 10, 15 years down the line. And I think that's a real challenge, not just for businesses and investors, it's also for the public sector, honestly, and for policymakers, because we don't tend to think that far in advance, right? So there's sort of, if I don't see a return on investment annually on what you're saying you're addressing as the problem, as the ultimate goal, you know, maybe I'll wait a year, maybe I'll wait 3 years, but after that, I don't think this is worth my while. I'm not seeing the reported return on investment on that. And that's a question, I think, of sustainability. And then I think a point related to that is if we cannot measure it. So there's some things around social impact that are really, really difficult to measure. I'll take, actually, there's 2 examples, but the ones that we face are related to child protection. Trying to get an accurate measurement of violence against children or even child labor, it's slightly easier, but even then is very difficult. And to be able to do that well, to be able to do that ethically, means that we need to invest a lot of resources. And sometimes, honestly, we simply can't do it for certain populations in certain areas. Just because we can't measure it doesn't mean we shouldn't try investing in solving the problem and creating that social impact, right? It's still a very important issue. And I think traditionally, if you think about development as a space, that is often where you get your sort of nonprofits, your sort of, you know, development donors coming in, because that is not something that essentially a for-profit would necessarily invest in, because it's just very difficult to define. And, you know, to your investors, what did you actually achieve by making those investments? And then the sort of final point I'll talk a little bit about, because that speaks to the heart of me as an evaluator and my career. Even if we measure an outcome that we want to, and even if it's possible to do that on an annual basis, for example, because that's what we want to return back to our investors, how do we actually prove that your investment made the difference, right? How do we prove that the money, the inputs, whether it's money or whether it's resources, whatever it is, actually helped achieve that change? And I think that's also a little bit what Ved and Aparajita were saying. You know, you could, for example, be supporting a job platform for young people. You could connect them to employment opportunities. But if youth employment rates increase, for example, is it because you because a firm or a group of people or whoever it is invested in that platform? Or could it also be because generally the economy is improving, perhaps generally education levels are improving, income levels are improving? So there's the issue of contribution there. And I think that is where often we get stuck when it comes to social impact, because the moment we think about how complex social impact is to achieve, how it takes time, and then how many other factors would need to be right to be able to achieve that, is very difficult to say that the $1 that I have spent on X is translating to so many girls who are not getting married, or so many jobs for young people, right? And so I think for complex issues, it's difficult because you need multiple strategies, and investing in one is not sufficient, but investing in multiple becomes difficult to measure. And so I wanted to sort of end a little bit with speaking from my strength, a little bit from being an evaluator. And that last question on how do you do good social impact, right? Everything I've talked to you about is really about thinking about evaluative thinking, right? How do we get from the inputs, the outputs, the outcomes, complexity, contribution, etc. And how do you measure it well? So how do we, at least in the development sector, in the sector that I've worked in, actually do good evaluations of social impact? So the first thing is we start with a very strong theory of change and results framework. So I think that's been said, and Aparajita was mentioning how there's so many of them and that we need to sort of standardize them, but that is absolutely a bedrock. And you need to know what you will evaluate, how you will measure it, that it is in a way that is concrete, but not over simplified, and we need to invest sufficient in measurement, right? I also think it's worth thinking about different evaluation designs or approaches over a longer period of time, because one of the things I was saying is it takes a longer period of time often to achieve social impact. So you can start with sort of design, what we would call design evaluations, design reviews, really at the initial stage. Do we think that, you know, our theory of change results frameworks are robust? Do we think this has the largest chance of success? Formative evaluations through the course of the, you know, the solution essentially that you're investing in, and then summative at the end. It's about course correction, learning, and accountability. And then I think there's also something to be said for adhering to the standards. And I think, Aparajita, you also mentioned it in terms of, oh, actually, and I think Ved mentioned it, you know, accountability, transparency, all of these standards around evaluation is at a minimum what we need to adhere to make sure that it's credible. So follow some standard key norms, some standardized key norms and standards for the whole development space. And I'm going to plug here the framework that we usually use as the UN as a whole, and it's something that, you know, you can consider also more broadly beyond just the UN. But we use the OECD DAC criteria to do a lot of our evaluations around social impact. And the important thing here is that it doesn't only evaluate effectiveness, which is, are you getting results essentially, which is an obvious one. It doesn't only evaluate efficiency, or, you know, are you getting, I guess, the return on what you wanted, and what between different solutions, which one's the best value for money, best investment. It also speaks to relevance. So what does it mean? Are we doing the right thing for the right people? And I mentioned that before, there are different needs for different people, communities, areas, and the lower down the grassroots you go, the more specialized it might be, the most individual it might be. Coherence, how well is it aligned to what others are doing in this space? I don't have to duplicate, right? So how can I add to? And finally, sustainability, thinking of the long-term perspective. And what I would also do, speaking a little bit methodologically, but is also to think a bit more about the rigor of evaluations and how we do this. Essentially, we don't always have to use experimental, quasi-experimental designs. They are very good for establishing contribution, but we can also use things like theory tracing that is responding to the theory of change that was set out before. And again, what Ved said, I think also really think about the participatory nature, because impact for who, right? What does it mean actually? And if we're too high in the sky and we lose the perspective of what it actually means to the lives of the people that we're trying to impact, I think then we've lost actually the power of an evaluation in and of itself to be able to remind us of that. So I think it's also really important as we think of evaluations more generally around social impact that we capture the voices of the different stakeholders. And of course, that also tells a good story. So I think I'll stop there. I had a bunch of examples that I can speak to in the Q&A and talk maybe a little bit more about the multi-stakeholder partnership piece. But I think it's an incredibly difficult, and I think that's also what Aparajita was saying, right? Different, lots of different definitions, frameworks, tools. Ved was saying also about, the complexity of moving beyond just the outputs. You're going to get a whole creation of different people saying different things are important to them. But I don't think just because it's difficult doesn't mean it's impossible. And I think that is what we have learned over the decades that, at least in my career, I've been working as an evaluation expert in the development sector, that, we're slowly chipping away at it. And it is true, we just need to make sure that we try to create a common vision of what we want to do around social impact. And then I think it's fairly easy, but with enough work to get the right stakeholders around the table to be able to achieve that. So I'll stop there.
It was a wonderful note also to get on, because I think you do bring about, so the SSE working paper actually does talk about the need for social audits or social auditors, people with precisely the skills that you've been speaking to, which is that evaluative thinking and taking a longer term perspective when it comes to how do we see impact and what does it mean operationally. So I'm actually going to go back to what I Ved for a second here, and to actually ask about that. He has been mentoring a lot of social entrepreneurs. He has actually pitched for the DIB, or the Developmental Impact Bond, as a massive partnership. That the only way that what you, Maaike, and Aparajita actually bring to the table is that the only way it's possible for social entrepreneurs is to come out through partnerships that not only look at capital, which is what the SSE will technically enable, but another way in which you have operational and implementation partnerships where evaluation or measurement is embedded, and where you're not looking just at the unit, but probably at the impact progression. And that might be, but there is still that resistance, which Ved, you mentioned very beautifully, in which, where do you start becoming sensitive first? To the community, who are your grassroots, your beneficiary, to your implementer who's just trying to create the impact to begin with, the animal, as you put it, or then due to your investor who has put in the money, who's put in the faith in you and said, yeah, let's do this. And they have their own reporting and implementation, reporting responsibilities and accountability. So how does that actually end up working? And how does an entrepreneur actually start addressing all of that, or even creating that? You as a person who's worked with multiple partnerships.
I think the problem is in partnership is that men come from Mars and women come from, what I'm trying to say is that if we come from three very different perspectives and if we have no meeting ground, and Maaike, I think you are speaking as an ideal evaluator, and Aparajita, you speak as if you're an ideal investor, then there's no meeting ground. I'm just trying to make it up. I'm not saying you did. But what happened in SSE also, we had three different groups, and we had to find a golden mean, if you say, that the implementer, say a social entrepreneur, whether a for-profit variety or a not-for-profit variety, is a poor guy is implementing. I'm speaking from my side. He's in the trenches. He's trying to make sure that impact happens, first of all. And you come here, I'll give you money only if I can measure your impact. So what I'm trying to say is this: the exercise in social stock exchange or DIB is to find what will work first, because everything has to move from stages. So as it happened in education space, educate girls was the simplest indicator, in the sense of not child marriage or violence against children or the more complex social problems that we face. Enrollment of the girls, meaning girls coming to school, simple indicator that Sabeena came up with, and people said, okay, as long as you can say there's an increment, whatever theory of change might have been that of Sabeena, in this case, educate girls, that they made sure there were X number of girls in year 1, there were 2X in year 2 and 3X in year 3, suppose, very simply. Then evaluators only would go and measure the number of girls. Again, they will not say from which community they come from, they are Brahmin girls or they are tribal girls or they are Dalit girls and so on. But as you go forward in year 2, year 3, they may agree that, okay, not only it is important to get girls from a number of girls, but it is important to get girls from Dalit families. Then you may say it is not important to get girls only in urban areas, Dalit girls in urban areas, but Dalit girls in the rural areas also. You can actually you can change or shift the goals post, but mutual agreement is important in such circumstances. So I think what I'm trying to say is this: in terms of sensitivity has to be mutual. It is openness to accept the difficulty or complexity in implementation. And putting, say, a implementation team in a block, in a village, to go and work with the villagers to actually convince. What happens in the theory of change? What is theory of change? Theory of change is a set of activities that you are undertaking to convince, say, community to change their behavior. To change their behavior, for example, that we should convince people to build toilets. Now, toilets or whatever. So we'll say that community will undertake action. What action it will take? It will say, okay, I can give 12,000 rupees for the toilet, that in the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. They'll put up the 12,000 rupees. For that, they have to have drinking water. For that, there has to be willingness to use the toilet rather than go into open. So the theory of change is a set of actions against past behavior of a certain community. In that is so understanding the complexity of action, complexity of bringing about change. Similarly, implementers have to understand the difficulty and accountability of the people who give money. They are accountable to somebody who's giving money, right? In a recent conversation, there was somebody who's from the donor side and somebody from the implementer side. So the implementer is saying the same thing that we are talking about. It's so complex, it's a complex indicator. It will take time, as Maaike was saying, to bring about change. So please don't measure and don't just sit there and pontificate that you have to measure, be accountable. But the donor side, and I won't name the person, who's been in a very high position into very large donors from one to the other, he says, yeah, I work out of a CSR. The CSR team is accountable to the company, and company directors. So company directors can't say, okay, because it's Ved Arya, we'll accept whatever Ved does. It's not going to work like that. So the accountability part is also on the donor side. Accountability is also on the person who's giving money. Why evaluators are required? In the impact investor, in the implementer, why evaluator is required? They could settle the thing. Miya Bibi Raji to kya karega Kaji? Why Kaji is required? The Kaji is required because seen to be a third party, unbiased Maaike. Maaike is expected to be unbiased. So that is why the evaluation frameworks are required. But the social auditor's role is not an envious role, because they will be hated if they give B report, if they give C, or if they give D, or if they give adverse report. Like if somebody comes for the passport, you don't bribe the policeman, but you try to make sure that he gives you a positive report that you reside in certain such place. The evaluators live in a very, very difficult place. I don't envy you, Maaike, at all, but I think these are important. These are important roles, because Kaji is required, judge is required when the two parties are fighting. So I think I want to just say, but one more question I want to answer, Sabeena, is that the relationship between the investor and the social entrepreneur, who's also trying to make the social impact, is it so very different for investors who are investing in a pure or for-profit or commercial entrepreneur? What I'm seeing in Buddha Fellows is that, in a simple way I'm trying to put together, some friends of mine in the US are in the Silicon Valley, and they are like VCs. They are venture capitalists. So they kept pushing me to think, okay, give me the metrics for Buddha Fellows. Give me the metrics. Unless you can evaluate them against some not output. What I'm saying is not output, but outcome and the result. I don't think we will fund Buddha Fellows. So the problem we find is that social impact is sometimes or oftentimes far from the lens of the impact investor. He or she is more obsessed about getting the returns in 3 years or 6 years and exit the company. That mindset, and I've noted down, the issue of mindset is the primary one here. What is the mindset with which you are coming to the table? What is the mindset you are bringing the Buddha Fellow, the social entrepreneur to the table? What is the mindset otherwise in a commercial investor and a commercial entrepreneur? Maybe it's much easier, but the mindset is the same. Go damn the environment. Go damn the Dalits and Adivasis. You make profit as the primary goal. So, but when you have social entrepreneur who's also keen to make social impact in the lives of Dalits or lives of girls or lives of Adivasis, then you are asked to also produce those outcomes. At the same time, I am expecting the investor to also become that's the name Buddha, compassionate capitalist. How do you find a capitalist who is compassionate? So that is where trusteeship principle of Gandhiji comes in. I'll stop here, but I think we are in an interesting place, as Chinese say.
That's a wonderful note. I wonder if Aparajita has come back, because I actually wanted to get her 2 cents on exactly this relationship. It's almost it's a strange relationship that investors end up playing, because what you're actually talking about is power hierarchies in the chain. That even an investor, if it's a CSR, will have to report back to their boards. Investors like Value for Women and Telecap had to report back an SROI or an ROI, whatever that may be, but have to report back. The reporting and the compliance that gets attached to a social entrepreneur, to any entrepreneur, but the social entrepreneurs particularly so. So that becomes like the cost of even entering into the social impact space. What does that mean, and how do you start negotiating that participatory relationship when you go into the space? Like when you, as an investor, talk to a social entrepreneur, even a for-profit or not for-profit, it makes no difference. How do you actually start having that conversation when there is a clear power differential? You yourself have that power differential. And that then has to somehow be converted into a partnership. That can be measured later, which I'll come to Maaike. The partnership part, how do you start measuring a partnership for its activities? I mean, I think that kind of I'd love to hear your 2 cents, Aparajita.
So I guess to answer your question, I feel like, okay, so just going back, one on social, I think it's important to remember in the context of India, social entrepreneurs and social enterprises is not a recognized asset class. And hopefully having a social stock exchange would eventually allow that, right? So you don't, when organizations or companies call themselves social enterprises, it's the storytelling they're doing. There's nothing that actually fit by any level of legal or fiduciary way of categorizing. There is nothing that actually categorizes them like that. Unlike Sabeena Labs, which does that for a whole lot of organizations across different countries in the world. And I think that's important to remember, because of that, most organizations actually do not have any fiduciary responsibility to do. They do not have to report anything. They do not, and as an investor, and just a small correction there, we are not an investor, we are an intermediary organization offering advisory services. Intellicap was also is also an intermediary organization and not an investor. But going back to your question, as an investor, when an investor starts speaking to an enterprise or a donor starts speaking to an NGO for grant funding or for investment, the challenge is not really around what needs to be reported, because the reporting metrics are the arrangement between the two parties to define, to be able to keep on track or to hit certain milestones, because there might be payments linked to it. So unlike a company, unlike a listed company, which needs to publish its results, private limited companies don't need to do that. They don't need, or private limited companies definitely don't need to do that. NGOs, yes, need to have an annual report, but technically are not bound by any other legality beyond that. They can't, if they are sitting on a lot of surplus, nobody actually comes and questions them and saying, why are you sitting on so much surplus, right? So it's, you can maintain more surplus within your organization. You can retain profits, so to say. So I think hopefully the social stock exchange can help address some of these issues, because we do know that there are problems around this. We do know that there are problems around capital getting lumped up in specific organizations around it. But I'm digressing here. Going back to your specific question around, and I think that's largely linked to the power dynamic. I think the question around power dynamics, I think, is the more critical one to answer here, right? As between a capital allocator, capital provider, and a capital receiver, how do you ensure that the same level of power dynamics get retained? And I think we are seeing those structures emerge in specific areas, especially like DIBs do that quite effectively, where all parties actually come together in defining what's going to be measured, what's going to be, what are people agreeing on achieving in terms of outcomes, and what are they going to get paid for against those terms. In the case of enterprises and investor relations, we usually see that it's more of a milestone-based approach, and I think it's completely onto an entrepreneur to push back and suggest what is possible for them. And what's not, and instead not bow down to what an investor is asking for, but really be able to stick to their own projections, to their own targets, and to their own profitability projections and margins around these, or if it's not profitable. But I guess the challenge is that we do see that people want to be able to raise more capital, especially in the case of social enterprises and enterprises. They do want to be able to raise more capital, and sometimes that capital depends on how much they can achieve in a certain amount of time. So it's not really, I feel the onus is really on the enterprises and on the organizations to be able to frameworks and about saying this is exactly what they do and how they do it.
That is valuable. I think part of it is a legal framework, which I think the SSE is kind of reshaping for us. It is definitely going to be reshaping the way we view social enterprises, legitimizing an entity that was so far, as you called it very rightfully, storytelling. And so much of it was the communicative aspect. So Maaike, because UNICEF does actually rely heavily on partnerships. It relies heavily on how we actually start even bringing various players to the table and then seeing how the chain of service delivery is established. So there is from actually the TOC, which is the service delivery design, and it could be from the results framework to maybe a disbursement linked indicator or something. But the idea is that there are actually multiple partners who are helping along the way. UNICEF gets to usually do the 60,000 feet in the air perspective. I don't think social entrepreneurs get to do it as much. I think one of the most recent impact bonds that have come into the market, development impact bonds, have been from yesterday, I think, or yesterday, day before yesterday, of the Skill India mission, which is with SIF and with USAID, and it's a massive, massive partnership.
Yeah.
And very clever, and they've kept it small. Frankly, for India's numbers, they've kept the impact value pretty small. It's only 50,000 people that they want to reach. So, even with that kind of a massive partnership, that is what they're keeping inside. So I want to actually come back to the evaluative thinking piece of this. With 700, 800 partners that NSDC has, that the Skill Mission has, with the amount of resources to have to still kind of put these kind of boundaries in. What does it mean in terms of evaluation? What does it mean in terms of building partnerships that way the Aparajita and investors and donors, everyone can actually get behind? And where do we begin as we talked about social auditors? Ved also talked about that very simple thing, that when you go in, how do you be an asset to an organization, to a partnership, rather than a punitive?
Lovely, great, very complicated questions, and it gets at the core of my identity. Thank you, Sabeena. Ved also for saying that he does not envy my job. Yes, so as UNICEF, but also in a lot of the other organizations I've worked at, it really is about a sort of massive programs, actually almost at the level of, often it's government programs, but working with various partners around that, and, at the very mile high, because scale and sustainability are the sort of two, leading thoughts around that. I'm going to get back to, and I know we talked a lot about it, and it speaks to one of the questions in the chat box as well. It is about speaking the same language, right? So I think that's exactly what Ved and Aparajita were saying. It is about, we and the DIBs do that well, because you get everyone around the same table and agree, this is what we mean by impact, this is what we're going to do. That is literally what we do as evaluators at the start, right? What are you going to do? Tell us. What does that mean to you? What does that mean to you? What does that mean to you? And it's about aligning the interests and the understanding of what that very basic concept means of what your goal is. And then I'm going to start, I think the question was also that challenge that also Ved mentioned, right? If you can't break it down, so for example, I would say the SDGs is a great framework, because it really says by the year 2030, these are the outcomes that we need to achieve, full stop. Those are the sustainable development goals. They're aspirational, absolutely. So back to Ved's first point, that's the hope, the dream. We will not get there, I'm pretty sure, but they were aspirational. They were supposed to push us. But along the way, how do you craft very specific and measurable indicators that go down your results chain to say, this is how we're going to get to the impact? And so that means that in year one, if whoever's investing wants to see we're on the right track, you can give them an indicator that says, right down this results chain, we're here, this is what we've achieved, therefore we think this might be the impact that we achieve, right? So I think it's playing around a little bit with this sort of breaking it down into concrete measurable steps, because it can be very daunting, a big impact indicator. It is very complex, we all know that. And so breaking it down and agreeing to that around a sort of multi-stakeholder mechanism, I think is really important. I'm going to say two more things if you let me. One is that one of the things I would propose, and this is what we're starting to do a little bit more, which might be helpful as we think about how do we work together to really work towards impact investing, investors, implementers, evaluators, is to validate at the early stages. So what we do more and more now, I mentioned it before, is design evaluations or evaluability assessments. And they're really about, now we have designed this amazing thing. Now let's actually be real with ourselves and see, is it possible to eventually measure the results that we want to measure at every stage, at every milestone that we've set, right? Because what turns out often is that evaluators come in, they talk to everyone, they say, this is your results framework, and then we just assume that we're going to achieve it. Like the world is static, that things are not going to change, right? And I think that level of reflecting and being more adaptable as you go along, and we've seen it with COVID for sure, right? So things can go completely out of whack. And I think spending more time on those sorts of evaluative activities is much better for learning and course correction, which eventually then also means that you are the results you're accountable to showing, you can actually more problem solve this quick. Again, ultimately comes down to risk management, right? And that's, I mean, for everyone, it's about risk management. And then the final point I'm going to say, because you asked me to talk a little bit about partnerships. One of the models I'm going to give it as an example, and everyone here can sort of read up on it as a background, but it's something that I'm involved in as an evaluator, but it's a platform. So UA is a platform that has been incubated by UNICEF. We're not the only partners in it. Actually, we are one of some of the partners of it, and I hope people are aware of this platform. But really the idea is that this platform will help enable India's youth to connect them essentially to aspirational socioeconomic opportunities and engage them as the active change makers. And actually, UA has set sort of 3 10-year goals, a little bit like, I guess, the DIBs that you might have. These are what we want to achieve in 10 years. So it goes from 2020 to 2030 because we're trying to make a dent in the SDGs. So build pathways to aspirational socioeconomic opportunities for 100 million youth, facilitate 200 million youth to gain relevant skills for productive lives, and partner with 300 million youth as change makers and create spaces for developing their leadership. Again, these are aspirational. They've been set quite high on purpose. But what the platform in and of itself does is it brings together different types of partners to work together to the same goals. So what we call solution partners, they receive support, financial or otherwise, for doing sort of innovative implementation strategies that can be scaled. And that, so they basically get investment essentially to be able to scale some of their solutions. And then obviously the enabling partners, which are large partners who essentially can provide some funds or resources otherwise, who have this goal, this sort of adolescent development goal in their remit or are interested in that. And then the monitoring and evaluation piece, and that's really interesting, there's a secretariat that manages that. So it stands in the platform, and actually the secretariat's main function is not just to get on board to connect your partners, but very importantly, the monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And they have established an overall theory of change, a common results framework, a bunch of indicators that they're putting together now. They're going to develop an MIS, and we've got a series of evaluations that are planned over the course of essentially the 10 years, starting with right now, what I mentioned, the evaluability assessment. And the baseline, we're really looking at, now we've conceptualized this wonderful, brilliant thing. Are we shooting ourselves in the foot right now? And are we going to disappoint everyone, right? The investors and the solution partners, and ultimately the youth, because that's who we're doing it for. So I'll stop there as an example that I guess is an attempt that we're trying to do to bring everyone around the table.
What a wonderful point also to stop at, because I mean, we are at time, and thank you everyone for actually replying to the questions in the chat box. That's really, really helpful. But I love where this has gone, and I think that this is still a very nascent, emergent conversation about what it really means to move to recognize assets and to then move capital towards different kinds of initiatives. I'm truly, truly grateful to all speakers for some very, very valuable insights from coming from this implementation of operational perspective of what it means to actually be in the trenches and communicate at the same time. Aparajita, who talks about just how our fiduciary responsibilities actually shift based on where we are situated and what it might mean for us to work with enterprises and evaluators, and how it actually means to come together on that. And Maaike for giving all these different perspectives on where we can actually even begin thinking about measurement, that it might actually be, can we measure, and can we do it together? I think these are wonderful, wonderful things. And thank you all so much for a very, very rich discussion. And I honestly think this is just the beginning. The SSC is still an emergent concept. We're just literally scratching the surface. And I'm truly hoping that, like what you said, the secretariat would bring this consortium concept, and then what Aparajita also brought about our sitting at the cusp of these profits and governance, and how do you actually measure and work with this, the advisory role that IntelliCap and even Value for Women continue to play in that. Thank you all so much. It's been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And I hope I can bring you back for more conversations as we go forward, because I'm sure this is just the beginning. To everyone who's joined us, thank you all so much. If you have any further questions, feel free to write into us, get in touch. And of course, we're willing to listen and hear and learn from everyone. Thank you all so much for joining in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Aparajita.
Bye.
Thank you.